Winter, 1944, the Hürtgen Forest. To American infantryman Rocky Moretto, war on the European continent in the winter of 1944 and 1945 was mostly about never getting enough sleep, warmth, or relief. They told him it was the coldest winter in 100 years, a legend widely heard among GIs during the Battle of the Bulge. It was cold. It was snowing. They were moving constantly. They never seemed to get a break. When it was over, Moretto was one of only 2 soldiers in his rifle company who were not killed or wounded during the 11 months between Omaha Beach and VE Day. Moretto was a rifleman in Company C, 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Beginning on December 16, 1944, some 24 German divisions, 10 of them armored, launched a massive counterattack in the Ardennes sector. The Big Red One held the critical shoulder of the Bulge at Bulge, Belgium, destroying hundreds of German tanks in the process. From Moretto's perspective, the scale of the fighting was smaller, more personal. The battle began for him with German tanks emerging from snow and fog. There would have to be something wrong with you if you weren't frightened. That first morning when all those German tanks came over the rise with machine guns firing, they ran right over the American outpost and broke through the line. But American artillery slaughtered the infantry accompanying them. The German infantry never did break through, but 2 tanks did. Amid heavy fighting, Moretto and his fellow riflemen heard many rumors. Germans were infiltrating U.S. lines wearing American uniforms. That one was true. Germans were dropping tanks by parachute behind the lines. That one was not. Already a seasoned veteran when the fight began, Moretto was caught up in a battle he probably never could have imagined when growing up. Born in 1924 in New York City, he grew up in Hell's Kitchen. He was active in sports, baseball, boxing, the usual pursuits of a city kid. Soon after Pearl Harbor, which happened when he was 17, they lowered the draft age. Moretto was in the first group of 18-year-olds to be drafted on February 12, 1943. The induction center was Fort Dix, New Jersey. He went to Camp Wheeler, Georgia, for 13 weeks of basic training. After basic, the Army wanted Moretto to become a non-commissioned officer. They kept him at Wheeler for further training. But the sergeant's stripes were not to come immediately. He screwed up, as he put it. They were on guard duty one night, and he tossed a firecracker under one of the sentry's beds while the man was sleeping, so they shipped him out of NCO school. He went from there to Camp Swift, Texas, and joined the 97th Infantry Division. He stayed with them a few months. Then they decided to thin out their ranks for reasons unknown to him. A group of soldiers was shipped east to Fort Meade, Maryland. But that didn't turn out to be their port of embarkation. They were given clothing and equipment and sent to Massachusetts. Just replacement troops, not in a specific unit. They were in Massachusetts 10 days or 2 weeks, then were shipped by train to Canada. There they boarded the Mauretania, a former ocean liner now converted to a troop ship, and sailed for Liverpool. There were 10 or 12,000 troops on that ship. Moretto arrived in Liverpool during the first week of November 1943. He was taken to a replacement depot and then sent to Swanage, England, to join the 1st Infantry Division as a replacement. They had just gotten back from the campaign in Sicily, where they had made the invasion. They had invaded North Africa before that. They came to England to prepare for D-Day. It was widely known they were preparing for an invasion of Europe, but no one knew where the invasion would take place. Moretto made private first class a week or two before the invasion. He landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, in the second wave. If you've ever been on Omaha Beach, there's a plaque to mark where they landed. They had to go up an incline and take some high ground while under fire. You can't believe how chaotic everything was. They lost track of time. His impression was they landed in the afternoon. Even aboard the landing boat itself, there was pandemonium. The pilot kept running into prefabricated obstacles and sandbars, saying he was going to get them in as close as he could. They were having a difficult time getting in, and German artillery was falling on them. The pilot said he was sorry, but he had to drop them off. He dropped the ramp. Some of them were in very deep water with all their equipment. The currents were swift, and the German artillery had zeroed in on them. When they finally made it on land, there were at least a dozen guys hit by artillery. Somebody was yelling in the loudest voice Moretto had ever heard, "Get off this beach!" They were in a minefield. There were 4 of them trying to get uphill. 3 made it. 1 was blown up by a mine. Moretto credited his survival in the early fighting to the fact that he was part of the Big Red One, a battle-seasoned unit, well-trained, disciplined. They fought without stopping, with very little sleep, until around June 13th. Then they finally stopped at Como and got some rest. They were sticking out like a sore thumb. The British on their left flank were having difficulty keeping up. Their objective was to take Caen, and they were having a difficult time. The unit on the right was lagging too, so the Big Red One was kind of exposed. They were stalled there until maybe mid-July. The 5th U.S. Division relieved them, and that's when they got a respite. But not for long. Moretto and his fellow soldiers were designated to make the breakthrough at Saint-Lô on July 25, 1944. That's when they broke out of Normandy. They helped close the Falaise Gap in early August. In late August, the campaign in Normandy came to a close. They had a couple of days' rest, and then fought on through northern France to the Belgian border. They had a very big fight in the Mons area, where they ran into a very large German contingent trying to get back to the Siegfried Line. It was a hell of a fight. They were badly outnumbered. But they were lucky. They were in the right place at the right time. They killed a lot of Germans and captured thousands. Having frequent close-quarters contact with the enemy affected soldiers in different ways. In Moretto's case, surviving each new firefight gave him a deceptive sense of security. Guys were getting killed within arm's length, and he was not being touched. For a time, he started thinking that he could do no wrong. Company C was in heavy fighting in the Hürtgen Forest as summer became autumn, then winter. Moretto and his buddies were slogging through cold, wet weather with snow on the ground and fog frequently in the air. The abrupt front-wide counterattack by German armies on December 16, 1944, surprised Allied commanders in the Ardennes. A forested plateau in northern France that had been the scene of earlier fighting in both world wars. At various points along the front, German troops and tanks broke through American defenses. As viewed on the map, the assault created a bulge which, if it grew large enough, might divide the Allied armies and enable the Germans to drive for and recapture the major supply port of Antwerp in Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. It was a massive attack and a kind of last gasp for Adolf Hitler. The Germans opened the assault along a 50-mile front, initially with 21 infantry and armored divisions. One German unit used captured U.S. tanks and vehicles to confuse the American defenders. Along the front, German saboteurs appeared in American uniforms, many of them speaking English and spreading inaccurate information. The battles swept across parts of Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg, in addition to France, all in the midst of a temporary warming that produced heavy fog without providing much relief from the bitter cold. Of the 600,000 GIs involved, almost 20,000 were killed. Another 20,000 were captured. 40,000 were wounded. In one incident, 7,500 men surrendered, the largest mass surrender in the war against Germany. Company C was transferred to a different battalion, the 2nd, just in time for the Bulge. At Dom Bütgenbach, Belgium, Moretto and his buddies came under attack from German troops and tanks. Moretto's battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, drew the task of relieving engineers who were defending Bulge by holding the line at Dom Bütgenbach. Not far from Moretto, the 33rd Field Artillery Battalion dug in with 105mm howitzers. As the Germans came at Moretto and his buddies late in the day on December 17th, their assault began a battle in which artillery would play a key role. Most of the casualties on both sides would be claimed by howitzer and mortar shells. Still, Moretto has vivid memories of constantly using his M1 Garand rifle during 3 days of fighting between December 17th and 19th. At one juncture, he sighted on a pair of German soldiers charging up a snow-covered rise about 40 feet away and pumped bullets into them. It's very rare when you get a clean shot at an enemy soldier with your rifle. You're usually not closing with the enemy. The longer you go, the more you start to lose the feeling that you can do no wrong. That didn't happen to Moretto until after the Bulge, in April or May. Psychologically, you're always afraid, but the longer you stay at it, the less sharp you feel. Everybody knew that you were there for the duration, plus maybe 6 months beyond. Everybody talked about the $1 million wound, the only way to get home. Between point-blank firefights, Moretto and his fellow infantrymen found themselves caught up in fierce artillery barrages. Moretto's best friend, Sergeant Bob Wright, was killed by an exploding German artillery shell only feet in front of Moretto's foxhole. While U.S. soldiers fought in snow, fog, and muck, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower ordered in reinforcements and struggled to settle disputes among his subordinates. By December 19th, American troops were surrounded at the crossroads village of Bastogne, Belgium. When faced with a German demand for surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe delivered a memorable reply. Nuts! Although Moretto's outfit stood its ground, the Germans appeared to be winning elsewhere on the front and on the verge of a breakthrough. The rumors were flying everywhere. Everything changed on Christmas Day, when improving weather and clearing skies enabled Allied planes to attack German troops and to parachute supplies to American forces. Britain's Field Marshal, Bernard Montgomery, who was nominally Eisenhower's subordinate but feuded constantly with him, announced the end of the Battle of the Bulge in a press conference on January 7, 1945. American soldiers didn't like that one bit. U.S. troops had carried out the bulk of the fighting. The German offensive in the Ardennes ended up being a significant American victory. Some 30,000 Germans were killed, 40,000 were wounded, 30,000 became prisoners of war. Today, some view the Battle of the Bulge as prolonging the war in Europe unnecessarily. Others see the battle as signaling the end of Hitler's Third Reich, which came in May 1945. To Rocky Moretto, it was the beginning of the end. When the war concluded, Private Benny Zuskin and he were the only two in their company who went through the whole thing without being killed, captured, or wounded. Moretto returned home after the war. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company for 40 years. He was active with the American Legion and VFW. He passed away on August 26, 2018, at the age of 94. The story of Rocky Moretto is the story of thousands of American infantrymen who endured the coldest winter, the longest battle, and the hardest fighting of the European war. Men who held the line when the Germans threw everything they had at them. Men who survived by luck, by training, by sheer determination. In the end, it was men like Moretto who won the war. Not with grand strategy or brilliant tactics, but with frozen fingers on rifle triggers, with foxholes dug in frozen ground, with one foot in front of the other through snow and mud and blood. They were just doing their jobs, staying alive, keeping their buddies alive when they could, and when it was over, going home to build quiet lives and rarely talk about what they'd seen. That was the greatest generation. Not because they were perfect, but because when their moment came, they did what needed to be done.